First and foremost, let me again say good afternoon, and what a great honor and a privilege it is to be with you today. This part of the program is a particular pleasure and a bit of a daunting challenge to be following in the footsteps of Stephen Payne, the global communications executive who served as your inaugural speaker last year. His talk provided a really wonderful look at the simple yet profound principles at the core of good business practice, whether discussing his family's produce business, which carried the words service, civility, satisfaction on every bag given to customers, or the corporate branding, reputation management, and social conscience necessary for global firms to succeed today. The message was the same. Define yourself, take pride in your product, build trust, and work together for good. Steve also touched on this very exciting era of global communication, an era in which we all can and should play a role. And that's our launch point for today's talk, which is entitled Global Connections from Local Sources, from Gutenberg to Google to You. Perhaps as you read, as I did recently, that the last survivor of the Titanic, a woman named Melvina Dean, passed away earlier this month at the age of 97. In Washington, I'm a member of a small group called the Men's Titanic Society. There are just over 20 members, and we gather once each year on the anniversary of the sinking of the ship to honor those who perished. Legend has it that one of the most important men in the history of global communication, David Sarnoff, who rose to become chairman of RCA and the founder of NBC Radio and Television in America, received the first SOS signal from the RMS Titanic while on duty as a very young telegraph operator for the Marconi Company. And of course, the story of the Titanic, as I have witnessed firsthand over the last couple of days, began right here. I have read and now seen and watched with great interest about the building of the Titanic by Belfast's Harland and Wolff shipyards, as well as your role in the upcoming 2012 centennial of the Titanic's ill-fated maiden voyage. I truly appreciate the fact that your city takes pride in building what was at the time the most advanced piece of technology the world has ever seen. And yes, I've read this wonderfully ironic quote about its construction. She was fine when she left here. As the travel publisher Lonely Planet points out, as 2012 approaches, it seems somehow fitting that Belfast should celebrate the Titanic's creation, building new pride and optimism out of the wreckage of past disaster. Get here early and enjoy it before the rest of the world arrives. This, I believe, is a remarkable testament to your spirit and your perseverance. The idea of building the Titanic was conceived in 1907, about the time the great American humorist Mark Twain told a New York City dinner gathering, "There are only two forces that can carry light to all corners of the globe, only two, the sun in the heavens and the Associated Press down here." Today, thanks to the internet, we would have to add lonelyplanet.com and many thousands of other websites to that list. Imagine how different the information flow would have been on that fateful night of April 14, 1912, if those aboard the Titanic had been able to send an email or a text message or a tweet or post a video from their iPhone. Could there have been a better example today of the impact of social networking than what we've witnessed over the past 2 weeks in Iran? When the government cracked down on Western journalist coverage of the post-presidential election protests, Iranian citizens turned to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube to rally their supporters and to keep the rest of the world informed. Among those monitoring these social networking sites are the Associated Press, CNN, and even the United States State Department. We live in a stunning age of global communication, an age in which everyone can be the media, where anyone operating out of their kitchen or even on the street can reach the same number of people as our most respected news outlets, an era in which local sources can achieve global connections. What's happening in Iran also represents an important convergence of traditional and new media platforms. What we're seeing from Iran is what I would consider a series of flashing lights. Often it's hard to discern the big picture from the individual postings. So to place context on the activities, we still turn to our traditional journalistic entities like the Associated Press, Reuters, CNN, and our local newspapers. We still need to be able to turn to entities that we trust. To those in the news business, this is what still separates at least some of the so-called pajama journalists and citizen journalists from entities like the New York Times. And in the world of journalism, as we've discussed here today already, an editorial battle is raging right now between informed reporting, opinion journalism, citizen journalism, conjecture, sloppy reporting, and even purposeful fabrications. We see examples every day of the challenges we're facing when we ask the question, who do you trust? You may have read a recent Associated Press story about 22-year-old University College Dublin student Shane Fitzgerald, who posted a poetic but phony quote on Wikipedia to test how our globalized, increasingly internet-dependent media was upholding accuracy and accountability in an age of instant news. His report card, Wikipedia passed, journalism failed. The quote, which was added to the Wikipedia entry on Maurice Jarre hours after the French composer's death, was reported by dozens of U.S. blogs and newspaper websites in Britain, Australia, and India. They used the fabricated material even though administrators at the free online encyclopedia caught the quote's lack of attribution and removed it. A full month went by and there were no corrections. So the student, Fitzgerald, told several media outlets they had swallowed his baloney whole. The Guardian of Britain became the first to admit its staff member lifted material straight from Wikipedia. Fitzgerald said he's convinced that if he hadn't come forward, the quote would have gone down in history as something Maurice Jarre said, instead of something a student made up. It could have become an example where once anything is printed enough times in the media without challenge, it becomes fact. According to the reader's editor at The Guardian, the moral of this story is not that journalists should avoid Wikipedia, but they shouldn't use information they find there if it can't be traced back to a reliable primary source. So Shane Fitzgerald demonstrated that journalistic practices don't always live up to the principles of the profession, and every black eye hurts, especially now. These are very tough times, as we've discussed, for journalism in general and newspapers in particular. Sharp declines are reported in both circulation and advertising revenue. Many newspapers are cutting staff. Some are ending their hard copy editions and going online only, while still others are simply going out of business. And it is not just affecting smaller papers. Most major dailies in my country are in some financial trouble. The New York Times lost $74.5 million in the first quarter of this year. The Boston Globe, which is owned by the New York Times, is being threatened with possible shutdown. And those threats should be taken seriously. Since 2007, we have lost 8 major newspapers. Several other companies are now operating in bankruptcy. The challenges facing America's traditional media today are very similar to those facing the American car makers: outmoded business models, huge older infrastructures, and missed opportunities to drive forward when new technology allowed for it. Both the traditional media and the automakers now face competition from startups and more progressive organizations that are not wedded to older technology. In the case of newspapers, business has been lost because advertisers and readers are gravitating to online sources where the news has been, for the most part, free and where advertising costs much less. Based on these facts, one could justifiably ask, do our newspapers constitute a modern-day Titanic, thinking they were unsinkable until the iceberg was too close to avoid? Can they conceive of and implement new business models before it's too late? Americans facing 2 ongoing wars, a devastating economic recession, rising unemployment caused in part by the dramatic downsizing of the automobile industry, and other bad news items, are perhaps not as concerned as they might soon be about this transformation of journalism. It has not hit home yet that one day, soon, some cities and towns may be without coverage of their local politicians, their schools, and their police and fire departments. Digital democracy has arrived, and it's a good time to remind ourselves of the relationship between a free press and a free society. Journalism does not comprise millions of people simply saying and posting whatever they feel. Journalism involves a process of gathering, sorting, and reporting. In our new order, we seem to be playing a little fast and loose with that vital middle task, sorting, or verifying the facts before reporting. We must remember there's a difference between journalism and just jabbering, although I'm sure we could debate the jabbering capabilities of some journalists. Even in the case of the tweets from Iran, which have kept a vital communications link open, some experts see a danger in overestimating Twitter's role. They caution that the messages from the protesters do not necessarily reflect a majority view, but rather those of a younger and more liberal faction. So as important as this new communication tool has proven to be, we still need to have the information put into some context. In our digital democracy, we want to strive to achieve a tower of strength, not a tower of Babel. 150 years ago, Charles Dickens opened his Tale of Two Cities with this very compelling passage. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. Mr. Dickens' words seem as appropriate today as they were in 1859. But then, and now, much depends on your point of view. Are we overestimating the doomsaying? Sometimes we're a little too negative, like the American filmmaker and comedian Woody Allen, who once wrote, "More than any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly." So, with the proper reality checks, it's important to celebrate and embrace these incredible advances in technology that have brought us closer together than ever before. They have indeed enriched our lives. For instance, thanks to Skype, an internet video telephone service, I'm able to see and hear my 8-month-old granddaughter, who lives over 100 miles away. How wonderful something like that is. And yet, it may not be long before we consider Skype, Twitter, Facebook, and other current options obsolete. History demonstrates that from Gutenberg to Google, the only constant is change. Granted, it has never come this quickly, but it has always had remarkable effects. Johann Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press process in 1440, and that remained as our principal means of printing for over 500 years. His invention allowed for the first time the mass production of printed books. It put a lot of scribes at the time out of business. By 1499, an estimated 15 million books had been printed using this process. Imagine how this changed a world in which scholars used libraries that had previously held fewer than 24 handwritten volumes. Do you think the concept of posting a blog is new? Beginning in 59 BC, Julius Caesar ordered a sheet of daily events literally posted throughout Rome. News sheets began turning up in Germany in the early 1500s, and the first regularly published newspaper in Europe dates back to 1609. As you know, Northern Ireland's Newsletter began publishing in 1737. In the early 20th century, radio revolutionized mass communication. In 1933, the American President Franklin Roosevelt delivered the first inaugural address to be broadcast nationwide by radio. In the midst of our Great Depression, he launched his so-called New Deal policies by telling downtrodden Americans, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." That's a quote that we have heard many times this year. And it was radio that brought the battles of World War II into our homes. It's not unusual to see photos from that era of people sitting in their living rooms watching the radio. After the war came television, bringing the visual pain of conflict as well as the joy of discovery into our living rooms, first in black and white, and then in what we called at the time living color. It was television that allowed us all to leave our planet 40 years ago next month to show the first man landing on the moon. Then the internet, which again revolutionized communication. In 1998, 2 Stanford University graduate students set up shop in a garage in Menlo Park, California, and launched their newly named search engine, Google. That was followed by the social network sites, Facebook, MySpace, and a host of others. Web-based social network sites have actually been around since 1997, allowing individuals to create public profiles and correspond with a list of other users. In 2006, Time magazine named as its Person of the Year, you, placing a mirror on the cover of its special issue. According to the editors of Time, that seminal year told a story about community and collaboration on a scale never seen before. It referred to the World Wide Web as a tool for bringing together the small contributions of millions of people and making them matter. The editors concluded that we are ready to balance our diet of pre-digested news with raw feeds from Baghdad and Boston and Beijing. It's about the many wresting power from the few and helping one another for nothing, and how that will not only change the world, but also change the way the world changes. Time termed this nothing short of a revolution. 3 years later, that revolution is further empowering the individual. This was articulated during our 2008 presidential campaign when Barack Obama harnessed the viral power of the internet and revolutionized political communication. He actively engaged via Facebook, YouTube, and his own website, as well as through text messaging and Twitter. He created a community of support that contributed an astounding $500 million online, and the average donation was only $80 per person. Meanwhile, news coverage of the 2008 presidential campaign presented a convergence of traditional and new media. Huge audiences viewed candidate debates on television, and as a result of an unprecedented alliance between YouTube and CNN, previously passive viewers became active participants in the debate process. Nearly everything that appeared on television gained a second life online. And the newspapers still made their mark. Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of President John F. Kennedy, endorsed Barack Obama in a New York Times opinion editorial saying, "I have never had a president who inspired me the way people tell me that my father inspired them. But for the first time, I believe I have found the man who could be that president, not just for me, but for a new generation of Americans." That endorsement had a powerful impact, and it resonated on all media platforms. As the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 helped many Irish Americans feel a sense of full citizenship, the election of Barack Obama in 2008 represented for African Americans the realization of the dream of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King. On his election night, in November of 2008, Barack Obama told 250,000 supporters gathered in Chicago, "If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer." The election of an African American as President of the United States is a very proud moment for my country, and I hope for the world. There has been, however, precious little time to reflect on that achievement, as the new president faces challenges including a global financial crisis, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, nuclear arms control, the problems of the Middle East, health care reform, education, poverty, and energy and the environment. Like Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, President Obama is using new media platforms to carry his messages, push his political agenda, and thanks to social networking, initiate and encourage civic involvement, not just locally and nationally, but globally. The President has over 1.3 million followers on Twitter. He has been building this following for 28 months now, meaning he is transforming a unique campaign tool into one through which, as President, he could communicate directly with a broad constituency about policy issues. President Obama is following the first rule of politics. Define yourself before the opposition has an opportunity to define you. And in addition to using the news media to that end, he has in effect become the media. The President's recent speech to the Muslim world in Cairo is a very good example. My friend and colleague, CBS News White House correspondent Peter Mayer, reported on a high-profile White House strategy that spread Mr. Obama's message using MySpace, Facebook, and Twitter. It was a very calculated effort, with a White House spokesman pointing out that Facebook is the largest social network in the Muslim world, with nearly 20 million users. A State Department program also allowed international callers to register to receive free text messages on the President's speech in Arabic and several other languages. Video of the speech was streamed live on the White House website, and it was posted on YouTube. So the President not only delivered his message to the Muslim world locally in Cairo and allowed the journalistic community to report on it, he also communicated globally by establishing his own media network. Which brings to mind, on a much smaller scale, the recent evolution of my home school, the George Washington University, which raised its own profile by, in essence, becoming part of the media. It was not that long ago, in the 1990s, that GW, as we call it, was getting very little attention. Our president at the time, Stephen Joel Trachtenberg, was initiating innovative change in an effort to increase the university's prestige and reputation. As his program began to take shape through new academic offerings, construction of new facilities, creative recruiting methods, new campuses, and a much livelier campus life, he found it a challenge to get the word out. When he invited me to join the university, my challenge was to cast a spotlight on GW in order to bring attention to all of this positive change, and to do it in the middle of Washington, D.C., where the competition includes the White House and the Congress. It seemed our best bet was to take advantage of our wonderful location, our first-rate facilities, the intellect of our faculty, and the enthusiasm and aggressiveness of our students. We launched a strategic campaign to raise the university's profile through media and political partnerships that would bring newsmakers and decision-makers to our campus. Very shortly thereafter, GW won the competition to serve as the press center for the inauguration of President Bill Clinton. In the course of 20 days in January of 1993, the university hosted 800 visiting journalists, while 400 students volunteered to help. Along with the major newspapers, the television and radio networks were on campus every day, and many of their programs were broadcast live. About that time, we also created a new paragraph for our press releases, letting the world know who and where we were. It began, located 4 blocks from the White House. The George Washington University is the largest institution of higher education in the nation's capital. Suffice it to say, the spotlight was cast. Within weeks of our having hosted the inaugural press center, journalists across the country began calling on our professors for other stories. Our name began to turn up in newspapers and on radio and television, seemingly everywhere. And the new paragraph in all those press releases began to take root. Within a year, the clue to a 3-letter answer in the New York Times crossword puzzle read, "University located near White House." The answer was GWU. It wasn't long before others called to ask if we could host their media events. The spotlights were now flashing brightly on the university and its attributes. Within 3 years, the George Washington University was named one of the top national universities in the United States by the magazine U.S. News and World Report. Then President Trachtenberg came back with a new mission. He said the lasting value of all of this visibility would be realized only if we could turn this series of flashing lights into a steady glow. From the media perspective, we were then able to launch an unprecedented partnership with CNN, under which its daily political debate program called Crossfire moved to our campus. Over the course of 5 years, from 2002 to 2007, we produced nearly 800 live programs, many of which aired globally. Politicians were now visiting our campus on a daily basis to participate in this program. 125,000 people joined our studio audience from as far away as China, as the show became a tourist attraction in Washington, D.C. 275 GW students worked on the project as production assistants and event managers, and several of them landed jobs at CNN upon graduation. And over the course of 5 years, the George Washington University received 2,293 on-air mentions. CNN had helped us turn that series of flashing lights into a steady glow. And we all understood that the visibility achieved through the media was ultimately designed to cast a spotlight on our academic excellence. Today, our new president, Dr. Stephen Knapp, is building on this foundation, growing our global reputation, and working to elevate GW into the top tier of national research universities. It's another great challenge. Through our new Global Media Institute, we're engaging in research and helping lead the public dialogue on the transformation of journalism in the 21st century. And we very much still believe in the power of media partnerships. We are currently producing programming for public television, satellite radio, and online audiences with partners including the National Press Club, the world's leading organization for professional journalists, the Newseum, America's only museum dedicated to the history of journalism, and Exploring the Arts, an educational foundation established by the legendary singer Tony Bennett. Meantime, our students are gaining valuable insights, not only in the classroom, but also through internships across Washington. They learn from people in the field as well as their professors. They study not only how to be good journalists, but also how journalism affects our society. Each year, some 1,400 George Washington University students study abroad. We have agreements with a number of institutions here in the UK, and we hope we will have an agreement with the University of Ulster. In addition, some 2,100 international students are studying at GW, including about 40 through exchange programs. And we offer a special semester in Washington program for students who would like to learn more about media, journalism, and politics in our nation's capital. And these are the programs we are discussing with your university as we seek to create a mutually beneficial and lasting relationship. And wherever they are, students are making global connections as new communication tools bring us closer together. And today, students, no less than the Associated Press or even the President of the United States, have the capacity to use these tools to help inform and perhaps even transform the world in which we live. We may be in some uncharted territory, but the challenges should not be foreign to us. Throughout history, it has been the responsibility of all of us to help realize the full positive potential of new technology. So what would Tom Curley, the current president of the Associated Press, say today about Mark Twain's quote of over a century ago? I posed that question to Tom Curley a few days ago, and here is his answer for you. More than 100 years after Mark Twain noted AP's reach, news is more in demand than ever. And news from AP not only permeates all corners of the globe, it shows up on every platform and in every format. But these changing news consumption patterns also threaten news organizations and makes AP's mission more essential than ever. As we have throughout our existence, AP must now innovate to find ways to continue providing the news that people everywhere need to know. And the president and publisher of the Washington Examiner newspaper, Michael Phelps, has added this assessment for you today on the future of journalism. The U.S. First Amendment and its analogs here and everywhere in the free world were not, of course, aimed to provide a special privilege to journalists. The free press is the privilege of free peoples, we the people, to enable us to find how well we're being served or failed by those we select to govern us. The fundamental fact of that privilege, and it is exactly that, transcends printer's ink and computer screen pixels. To the extent that critical information is devalued by free people, their hold on the rest of their freedoms becomes imperiled. Who will pay? I have not given up on the notion of the self-sustaining, self-perpetuating circle that inextricably links journalists with news and information of importance to readers, website visitors, viewers, and listeners to whom advertisers seek to peddle their goods and services. Just 3 weeks ago at Normandy, we commemorated the 65th anniversary of D-Day, one of the largest battles in the history of the world. Broadcaster and journalist Edward R. Murrow brought that battle and so many others in World War II to mass audiences using the then hot medium of radio. His broadcasts on CBS and on the BBC during the late 1930s are credited with helping America emerge from an isolationist period and more fully comprehend its role in the world. He made a difference by using a new mass medium to intelligently and accurately inform and influence public opinion. Later, Murrow would make great inroads with his use of the new medium of television. Ultimately, however, he became frustrated with what he considered the low expectations of television executives. In 1958, Edward R. Murrow delivered an address that remains a rallying cry for journalists even today. He closed that address with the following passage about television, a passage we could apply to all forms of communication today. Murrow told his audience, "This instrument can teach, it can illuminate, yes, and it can even inspire, but it can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it to those ends. Otherwise, it is merely lights and wires in a box." There is a great and perhaps decisive battle to be fought against ignorance, intolerance, and indifference. This weapon of television can be useful. Today, at the most local level of all, our fingertips, there is more information than Murrow could have ever imagined. And yes, the sheer volume seems sometimes to threaten to swallow us whole. But in the cacophony of voices online, there is a beautiful diversity and the promise of not merely 15 minutes of fame, but of deeper connections across a global divide. Let us use these tools wisely, and let us all work together to turn our own flashing lights into a steady glow. Thank you very much.